Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Calm COVID Convos. Lately, we've been evolving the conversation, but we set up the Calm COVID Convos with the whole idea of taking all the stress, the hype, and the drama out of all of the conversations around COVID and business in particular. So we've been evolving the conversation lately, which has been great, getting into some of more the other side of the COVID curve. So it's been great to have some of the interviews with Glenn Richards and Trent Ennis from Xero, but there are still a lot of practical things we need to think about on a daily basis. There are still new things that are coming up, whether it be JobKeeper related and how to make sure that money hits your bank account, or whether it be from that HR, IR sort of workplace health and safety focus as well. For those of you who don't know me, my name is John Knight. I'm the Managing Director and Founder of Business Depot, so I'll be facilitating the conversation today. And with us today on our screens, we have three lovely ladies who are excellent at their jobs. So Anna is the Head of People and Culture here at Business Depot, who helps us out internally and also provides services to our clients. Welcome, Anna. And we also have Justine. Some of you who've been on some of the other combos would have seen Justine on those. Justine's from IR Legal Solutions, expert in IR and employment matters. Welcome, Justine.
Hi, everyone. Hi, John. Thank you.
And new to the Calm COVID Convos is Jo Kidney. So Jo is a workplace health and safety guru. Now, who would have thought there would be someone that can be an absolute guru at workplace health and safety like Jo and turn workplace health and safety into an exciting topic to talk about?
You can't beat an introduction like that. Thanks, John.
But Jo's business focuses all day, every day on workplace health and safety. So thank you for doing that because it is important.
Some of us have to.
And so Jo's business, Kidney Occupational Health and Safety, she'll get right down to the nitty gritty of the workplace health and safety, but give you that practical sort of thinking around what to do within your business. And that's what today's about. So today's about getting back to work or getting back to the office. And so why we have these three lovely ladies on here is to cover off the practical side of things, to cover off on the legal side of things and from an employment contract perspective, and also cover off on that safety side of things, in particular that workplace health and safety and so forth. So I might kick off with you, Jo, if you don't mind. Can you give us that quick, simple snapshot of the Safework Australia requirements, in particular around the COVID?
Absolutely. Thanks so much. And it's a great introduction. I'll try not to keep it too dry for you, John. How's that? Definitely. So we certainly live in interesting times. So here we are, whether you've been a business that has continued to work, so there's some that have continued to work throughout or are now looking at a return to work, we're sort of coining this whole thing as a return to business. So it's returning your business to whatever the state it will be in whilst COVID is within our communities and societies. So as the restrictions ease and we have the roadmap, both at a Australia-wide level, but then each state or territory has putting its roadmap together on what the return to business and life looks like. So within that roadmap, you'll probably be able to identify where your business fits. So has it been or is it an essential worker and business, or are you looking to ease back in the coming month or two or three? And will that ease back be a combination of being back in the office, you know, going and visiting your customer sites? Maybe you're in the position where you can have staff working from home. But one way or another, it's about putting in place some arrangements in the coming sort of month, 2, 3 that set you up for success in your return to business.
So if I got this right, Jo, so there's a national layer and then there are state layers that we all need to worry about.
That is correct, yeah. So the government has got a national COVID commission, and it has established expectations and some high-level principles that must be followed within a return to work plan. And Safework Australia is the federal body that lays down the guidance that then the states and the territories choose to adopt. So what we see on the Safework Australia site are various resources, information about what should go in your plan. There's a copy of a template of a COVID risk assessment or a risk register. But really where businesses should be looking to is within their own state and territory. So whether that's Queensland, New South Wales or other. And on there, you'll find your government's expectations from a health and safety perspective in terms of returning to work. Now, if you're an organisation like a cafe or hospitality, it is going to be expected that there is a formal written plan that will be established that lays down the way in which you're going to manage COVID because of the potential interface you'll have with others that are coming in and out of the business.
Is there any business size sort of criteria on that, Joe?
No, it's actually established based on the type of business. So if you haven't already done so, it's really important to hop on to your regulator, health and safety regulator's site, and have a look and see whether or not you're part of that core business that has to have a plan in place, and then for staff get trained. And by extension of that, because it becomes a mandatory requirement, our understanding is that there will be some form of compliance framework put around that. So we could potentially expect to see COVID compliance officers entering workplaces to check those controls are actually in place.
Policemen, COVID police.
COVID police. If on the other hand, though, you're not one of those core services like a cafe or a restaurant, or somebody providing beauty type services that has to have those plans in place, but you're maybe like yourself, the business depot where you've got staff that are coming in and you may have visitors, it's still actually really important that you have plans in place. So the type of things that we are recommending are included in those plans are very similar to what you see in the mandatory plans. So that's looking at the workplace, making sure that you've got a social distancing between your work areas, probably moving away from using hot desks unless they're thoroughly cleaned between them, ensuring that you've got signs up that maybe indicate how many people can be in the kitchen or using the toilets or in the elevator at a given time. From a people perspective, putting in place controls for staff to understand what to expect when they come into the workplace. So they should only come in if they haven't got any symptoms of COVID or they haven't had contact with an active case. So there's still those quarantining type requirements that exist. So when they come into the workplace, they may well have to declare that they're fit and healthy to come in. And we're seeing a lot of businesses having a registration that when people come in the morning, they sign off to say they're fit and healthy. And if necessary, checking temperatures. You might ask staff to check their temperature before they leave, or in fact, do it when they get into the workplace. Once they're in, then you've got your arrangements for working in the office. So how many people can reasonably go into a meeting room, what your occupancy levels are, if necessary, taking out chairs so that you can't have too many people in a room that shouldn't be there at the same time, and any cleaning arrangements for those hot spots that you might see in the workplace. So the elevators, the handrails, the door handles, and where possible, just making sure that you've got good cleaning in place throughout the workday. On a practical note, the other thing that we're seeing in some workplaces is red teams and blue teams. So that might be that you've got staff rotating in and out, and not necessarily all staff on the same team at the same time, so that you've got good cover in the event of potentially somebody contracting COVID. And if you do contact tracing, that team may therefore need to work from home or be home based for a while.
I mean, that's a good risk mitigation strategy generally, isn't it? And
it is.
If someone gets it in the business, only half the business sort of gets
Precisely.
it.
Yeah. One interesting thing that we've got also is one business, and I think this is a really smart idea, is actually working a Thursday to Wednesday week. And so one team might come in Thursday, Friday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and they do a clean then on a Wednesday night. And they're actually...
So I was going to say that, Joe, because if you've got people sort of swapping during the day, so what, you make sure you schedule a clean before team B comes in.
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And I can see the logic in that, because it means therefore that staff are coming into the office for a portion of a week as opposed to every other week. And certainly in terms of that access into the workforce, the connectivity that's required, I think it's a really good option. The other important aspect of returning to work is also for your staff that may not come into your workplace but are going into others. So they might be visiting your customers or suppliers, etc. They also will have controls that need to be met, and so communication between you as a business and other businesses that your staff might visit, or if they're coming into yours, communication between business is going to be really important. And it's laid down in legislation that you should consult and communicate. We often think of it as being with workers, but actually in this instance, it's others we come in contact with for work reasons.
So we could be asking people sort of coming in the front door into the office, or if I'm sending a staff member out to a client, we could be asking them about their plans and their strategies.
Definitely. And in reality, you should also be communicating with them of what your plans are. And so if you have a restriction on people coming in who are symptomatic, that when they come in, they might need to declare to say that they're actually healthy and that they'll, have regard for your controls. You might lay those down just the same as you'd have a visitor sign in. You would also have something for a COVID sign in. And one of the important parts potentially of doing that is contact tracing. So whilst we've got the COVID Safe app and we're encouraging everybody to take it up, it's not a mandatory requirement. And so the reality is we still need to be able to do some contact tracing in the workplace. So having a log of who's coming in and out, particularly for visitors, will be really important.
I had my first sit-down lunch yesterday at a restaurant, which was very nice, by the way, to get out there and eat again. But yeah, they've got you writing down all your contact details. Do you think businesses should be doing the same thing? Like of anyone who comes through the door, getting them to sign a register or something?
I do. I think we need to be careful about confidentiality, and obviously we should respect that. However, knowing who's coming out of your premises, giving them some information about what to expect when they come in, and having their details in the event of a concern at your workplace will really enable contact tracing if it's required. The other thing that we're doing for some organisations is that they're asking staff to keep very careful logs in their diaries of what they're doing. So if they've been in an Uber or a taxi, or they've been on a train or a bus, they actually just keep a log of what they got on at what time, even not necessarily down to it, but even potentially the carriage they sat in. Because if there was contact tracing required, and say that staff member wasn't well enough to be able to do it, at least in the diaries, you'd then be able to access that information.
Should we be encouraging the download of the COVID Safe app with our employees? I assume we can't demand it.
We're definitely encouraging it. And I think if we're using social media and Facebook and other, then we're used to others potentially having access to our whereabouts. The information that I've had on it is a reasonable request of the government to ensure that we can do that contact tracing. So it's not mandatory, but we're certainly encouraging it.
Going back to one of the other points before, Joe, where you talked about sharing with our clients and our contacts that are coming into our space what we've done and what our plans are, would you be advocating that we should be emailing our policy to them or something to cover off on some of that?
Yeah, and in fact, we're just seeing that as good business practice. So it's a two-way conversation here. Putting in place a basic information that not only goes to your staff, but also to others that might come into your workplace or whose workplaces you go to. So information sheets or an email that goes out to them, actually, I think is an important part of your COVID plan. If you hop onto the Kidney website, there's actually a tab on there for COVID, and there is some resources, some PDFs that we've put up there with an info sheet of the type of information that you might put out for your for visitors that are coming in.
Yeah, I should have said at the beginning, if anybody does have any questions, please use the Q&A button down the bottom there. I'd much prefer you to use the Q&A if you can, so I can monitor the questions rather than the chat. But if you do have any questions for any of our panelists, please put those on there.
Perfect. So John, just one last thing. So we're seeing health and safety 4 steps. So basically understand the public health requirements, know what your health and safety requirements are, and put in place, step 2 is then put in place a plan. And there are templates available on the state and territory regulator sites, health and safety sites for devising a plan, and it gives you good guidance on what needs to go into it. So that covers off workplace, people, etc. The next thing to do before you let people come back in is communicate, inspect, and just check your arrangements are in place. Then you can have that gradual easing back to work, but you must maintain and monitor your arrangements. So it's not a one-time fix. We have to actually keep on top of it and respond if anything happens or doesn't go to plan.
Yeah, one more flow-on question for that, and I don't know whether this is your sort of part, Justine, whether you sort of come in. Well, what's the consequences if we don't do those types of things?
Well, first and foremost, Joe would comment as well. The risk is of infection, particularly if we have a second wave. So all of this is in the best interests of everyone to cooperate. Obviously, there's potential consequences in a work health and safety environment, particularly if these COVID police do start inspecting workplaces. There's potential for industrial disruption as well if unions are going out to inspect to see what businesses are doing in the COVID compliance space. So certainly from a work health and safety compliance piece, there's risks there if you're not taking all reasonable steps to ensure that your workers are safe in whatever environment they're going to be working in going forward.
Do you add anything to that, Jo?
Absolutely. Look, I completely agree with Justine. And at the end of the day, it is unfortunately workers that tend to get injured or ill. And the same will happen here if we've got workers that are coming in contact potentially with COVID. The other consideration is workers' compensation. So it would potentially be considered an occupational disease. And so whether that was time recovering or indeed a fatality as a result of, states and territories, workers' compensation regulators and insurers are starting to put out guidance on what protective mechanisms there are in place through insurance for workers that may contract COVID. So the ability to prevent it and also secure your position in the event of a claim will become incredibly important down the track.
And
Maybe work cover should start to cover the flu as well. What do you reckon?
Interesting, isn't it?
Justine, I think you were going to add something to that.
Yeah, I was just going to say the other issue is more disruption to your business. So you've just remobilized your workforce to get back to normal, and then you have a diagnosis on your site, and your site is then closed down while work health and safety work through its protocols, contact tracing. You'll have potential isolation of co-workers, extra cleaning that you need to go and do. So there can be added cost and time lost at what is going to be a real critical time for a lot of businesses to be able to get back to business.
Absolutely, that commercial sort of risk of just not being able to trade, not being able to trade normally is huge for many, many businesses out there. I must say, it makes me wonder whether we even bother coming back to the office and we just stay closed down, we don't bring people back. And I know from a very practical perspective, you've been looking at and working on all sorts of different things that we can do to still get people back into the office. Because obviously we want people back from a productivity perspective. They're not being unproductive, but there's certain people that'll be more effective in the office than others, and there's other reasons you want to get them back. What are some of the, I suppose, really practical things that you're advising people to do or you're doing internally?
Well, one of the first things we did was we carried out a survey with our team to find out who was effectively working at home and perhaps who wasn't really getting along well working at home for some reason, whether it be tech, productivity, efficiency, other people in the house, whatever it is. And so we got a really good snapshot of who would jump at the chance at coming back into the office, and who was happy to wait and who would like alternative arrangements and all that kind of stuff. We also added in there the ideal scenario for each person. So one of the things that we're sort of layering up is we're layering all of that workplace health and safety with the social distancing and the hygiene with everybody's individual scenarios. So who catches public transport, who's got hasn't got a home set up that's really ideal for more longer term arrangements and things like that. And those people, to be honest, who are just missing out on some of that interaction that they know helps them get their job satisfaction. So we've kind of been layering all of that up to get to a plan, and we're nearly there. It's quite a little complex sort of build of different things.
And we're not even a big business.
Yeah.
But some of the things I know you've been thinking about with our team, like who had to take their screens home. So if they've taken their screens home, they're not going to want to bring their screens back in on the train every Thursday and take them back every Monday sort of thing.
Yeah, that's
that
right.
nitty-gritty sort of detail.
Yeah, and things like, so we've stepped through the space. I did show this before. So we've actually got, this is the first cut of us looking at how our space is laid out. Things like, sanitary stations, signage, thoroughfares, sort of how people are going to interact in the workplace, desking, spacing. That was our first step, is based on the regulations, how many people can we actually, are we allowed to have in the office at any one time without putting pressure on all the communal spaces as well. So our desking's not such an issue, but it's all the other areas within our office environment that could become potentially an issue.
And I know you've even got to the extent of thinking about, well, what if no one had to touch the front door handle so that it was just left open, so that, you know, those sort of things sort of come through. On these regulations and these meterages that keep going around the place, like I know for dinners you can have 10 people, I think, in most states now. I'm not sure whether Victoria's opened that up yet. I know that there's this 1.5 metre rule, which sort of is just a self-distancing or social distancing thing. And then there's this 4 metre rule. I suppose, which ones are actual rules that we must comply with, or how should we be thinking about these? Who wants to go?
Joe?
So it really comes down to risk-based, and the conversation we're having at the moment assumes that there is no COVID in the workplace, and we're just trying to reduce the risk of it coming in. And certainly we're working on the assumption of a 1.5 metre distancing between people, and allowing a sufficient 4 metre space where necessary to provide for that work area. So if we've got desks that are maybe co-located, it's removing the use of a desk so that you've got those spacing between. So taking that floor plan, which is what Anna's done, becomes really critical to take a helicopter view, see what the entry points are through. If you've got an elevator, I know you don't there, but if you've got an elevator and people are coming in and using the lift, how many people actually physically can use the lift, or do you restrict the use of it?
Joe, can I just make mention of this latest, news story that lifts are exempt from social distancing? Have you heard about that?
I haven't heard about it. However, I would always put a health and safety hat on, and whilst your time in the lift might be fleeting, it is still a contained space. And so if we can, the feedback that I'm getting from COVID at the moment is that those people that are in a sort of more of an open type environment clearly have a reduced risk. So therefore limiting the contained close environments where people might be co-located together would be an important risk management measure. So there's both, what does the law say, but also what is a risk-based approach to it. And to pick up on Justine's point earlier about the complications of having an active COVID case in the workplace, the potential for close down and the contact tracing, it's partly about what the law says. So as a minimum requirement, be compliant, but actually think about the risks to your business. And where possible, manage those.
Yeah, which are huge. Maybe you just need to use your elbow in the lift or something.
Yeah, that's right.
That elbow rule.
I think that lifts were originally included, weren't they? And then they've now said the 4 metre rule doesn't apply, but it's still that reasonable practical test applies. So it's probably something that businesses that do have to use lifts to access their building or their floors, that they're talking to the property managers of those buildings to get an understanding of what measures they're putting in place, because that would be a communal area that the property managers would be responsible for. But you'd be giving clear guidance to your employees about sensible use of the list, or what's reasonable for, how many people can go in and how you line up. Presumably there'll be security at the front doors doing all those system checks as well. So, and I think initially that's where a lot of businesses were saying it's too hard for us to actually mobilise to go back to work, particularly with the fear of a second wave. But yeah, they've certainly loosened the requirements around lifts, so they're not exempt, but the full rule doesn't technically apply as what's reasonable in that particular scenario.
I think I saw a news story this morning that the Spotify offices have to come out and said their office will be closed until 2021. So that they can get their office into shape for such situations. I want to get really, really micro for a second here with these rules, okay? So the desking thing, if you're sitting people at a desk, they need to have 1.5 metres between, I suppose, this person and that person? Yes. What if there's a small divider in between this person and the person on the other side? Is that any value?
In an ideal world, if you were in that scenario, you'd actually stagger the people so that
you sort of zigzag it in
that's correct. Yeah.
And then the 4 metre rule, is that as simple as getting the square meterage of the office and dividing it by the number of people that are in there at a point in time?
It is. I mean, you have to take into account potentially unoccupied areas like cupboards, etc. But in essence, that's what you're looking at, is what your meterage is in with the premises, and then taking a reasonable risk-based approach as to how many staff you would have in at a given point. But you've still got to maintain that social distancing for where you then locate you and have your staff working.
And that's where the common areas become really important, to make sure that you don't have too many
right.
kitchen or the breakout room or something or other. They still have to be that 1.5.
That's right. And look, prompts on the floor are also important. So even if you of course get some tape and actually go, okay, if you're using the sink, what is 1.5 meters back from using the sink? Can somebody be using the fridge at the same time? So it is actually being quite practical about it. The other thing that I think is of a really big concern is the touch points. So where staff touch things, so opening a dishwasher, using the kettle, the points for the hot water, door handles. So certainly the regular cleaning of those becomes really important. You wouldn't wait until the end of the day before you would go through and make sure they're cleaned. So when we look at the typical sort of traditional office cleaning, that happens late evening or early morning. One of the parts of the plan is actually figuring out where those touch points are, what cleaning will go in place, who's going to do it and with what, so that it actually is followed through. And what we sometimes find with health and safety is that we put these arrangements in place and then they can drift. So taking that responsibility for making sure that they're suitable and sufficient, that they're sustainable as well, and not going to drift off within a few weeks.
And obviously they're really important. They're really important for the health of the people that are visiting, and for the health of the business as well, because of the interruption that it can. Most income protection insurance and so forth will not cover this situation.
Yeah, and we're actually saying, look, first come is not necessarily best dressed at this point. You actually might be better off waiting, seeing how other people are doing it, and then building your response based on some of the logic that falls out of it. Yeah.
And one of the things we are going to do is we are going to phase it in. So we're going to test run all of our changes that we're putting in place with a smaller group of people, so we can iron out any issues and get some feedback and all that kind of stuff before we start to kind of build up to that number that we can have back in.
And so I think we're going down the route of less likely being team A and team B, and just having those people who have taken their screens home, some of those types of things, some of those type of people sort of coming back in the first instance. I've got a few questions here I'll run past you on these sort of topics. Are there any set rules using lifts and foyers? We've talked about lifts. I assume foyers, same sort of rule, common sense from a risk planning perspective. Is international education with set physical distancing rules, or is it where possible?
Is international education, did you say?
Yeah, I don't understand that one. So maybe Vince, that question, maybe we can, if you can pop on and give us a bit more clarity on that question, we'll see if we can answer it for you. Got a question. I'm worried about privacy and confidentiality with the open list, such as cafes at present, because you can see who else has been eating there and their contact details and everything.
Yeah. That's actually a really good point. And so if you look at the way in which many organisations will have their inductions or visitors, you can get apps and applications to do that. So you can either get creative and try and do something maybe in SharePoint that could be established as a list, or alternatively, you can get books where people can sign in, but you actually tear the tag off so that you can't see the name of the person. Another option is to go for these third-party systems where they're designed for contractors and visitor management. So there's no shortage of using a solution to protect confidentiality. We just got to work out what suits the business.
Yeah, I mean, this question specifically addresses sort of DV orders and those types of things. So obviously there is something that we need to be really, really careful about there.
Absolutely, yeah.
Can you request your receptionist to do the cleaning in the office, or do you need to get a professional cleaner?
Well, that's partly health and safety and partly HR. Shall I hand that one to you first, Anna?
Yeah, so we're still.
Well, what do you think, Justine? Because I mean,
the legal maybe.
Actually, maybe Justine should answer first, then I'll answer off the back of Justine.
Because I'm in my home office and the neighbours have now decided that they're going to do their lawn. So if you hear mower or something in the background. I
All
apologise.
good.
When I'm not talking. Look, the Clerks Award in particular has been broadened out. So there is some flexibility measures at the moment where you can ask employees to do duties that they wouldn't otherwise ordinarily do. And if you've got JobKeeper, there's a number of flexible provisions under the Fair Work Act that you can utilise. It's all, again, what's reasonable. So it certainly wouldn't be reasonable to ask the receptionist to go and do a deep clean after a COVID-19 case. And so you'd really have to be sensible in terms of what you're asking there. And you'd need to provide PPE and training in these cases, because the last thing you want to do is put that individual employee at a heightened risk if you're not taking the right measures in place. So I think it needs to be still all in accordance with your work health and safety obligations in terms of reasonableness. And it might be appropriate for the receptionist, once someone's come in, that they do a quick clean behind, but with all the PPE equipment.
Yeah, good. Diane's got a question. Are there maximum numbers of people who should use amenities? For example, X number of toilets per X number of people.
From a health and safety perspective, we're certainly looking at how best to manage that. So if you've got a small number of cubicles in a relatively confined space, or even just one toilet and one hand basin, then certainly you would want to limit the number of individuals that may enter and leave at a certain time. I mean, if it's a fleeting entry into the toilet, I guess under COVID logic, you'd be able to say that the risks are limited. But certainly you'd want to try and encourage people to not congregate in the toilets and just to keep the numbers down.
Yeah. Another one here, customer facing roles who can't maintain a 1.5 metre during receiving, like when they receive payments. I'm assuming they're thinking of like Coles or Woolies or something.
Yes.
Is this brief transaction a problem if they put those sneeze guards in place?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And we're looking at COVID as being lower risk and higher risk. So what you're talking about there is a higher risk type scenario. And so where you've got close proximity or you can't maintain those distances, we do have to put additional controls in. And that's where we're moving away from general controls, which are probably fine most of the time, into saying that a basic risk assessment pertaining to that particular scenario becomes really important. So you could look at that counter service. Can you maintain some distance between the person standing and the person receiving? Is that going to be adequate? If not, then those perspex guards become really important. If you can't maintain adequate controls even within that, you'd be stepping in and saying, well, do you need to wear a mask? So we've got the ability to ramp the controls up, but really we would look at it on a risk base. And so what we're suggesting for businesses is if you can keep in the lower risk at all times, you've got your basic COVID controls. Anything that isn't managed adequately through the guidance that's being given, if either do it yourself or get a health and safety person to work through your higher risk scenarios with you, do a risk assessment, determine the controls, make sure staff are aware of them, put the resources in place, and then you'll be good to go. It's not it's the thing. Proactive is better than reactive in that instance.
Here's a good suggestion here for handling different receptions on the front desk when they have, say, the Saturday girl coming in. Should they have a different keyboard or something like that available? I know we talked about not doing hot desking anymore. Maybe that's an option.
Absolutely, and we're certainly suggesting that people shouldn't be sharing equipment unless it's cleaned between use. So, and that would be, even wiping down kettles in the kitchen. But yeah, we're recommending that if you've got somebody working in an office environment, maybe giving them an allocated set of tools that they use. So if they're using a clipboard and a pen, maybe give them one. It's not rotating between individuals. If it's a keyboard and a mouse, maybe it gets allocated to that person. If the business can bear the cost of that, great. If they can't, then it comes down to adequate cleaning between usage. Okay,
some great tips in there. Just want to shift the conversation now to some of the more contractual sort of employment law sort of side of things, Justine. And one of the things that's probably frustrated me to no end in the last couple of weeks is when an employer gives me a call and they have worked so hard to keep these employees in jobs, and then the employee turns around and says, I don't want JobKeeper, I want Job Seeker because I don't have to work for Job Seeker, or they don't show up for casual hours and those types of things. Do the employers have any power, or what can they do in that situation, Justine?
Yeah, so look, I've had a number of clients that have been impacted by this, particularly with the perception that JobKeeper is a payment to the employee. It passes on to the employee, but it's primarily designed as a wages subsidy for the employer. All the rules around employment law are still intact. So, your employees reasonable instructions in terms of duties or attendance at work, rostering, all of those rules still apply. Yes, there are some flexibility provisions in place to assist businesses being impacted by COVID-19. But if an employee is deciding that they don't want to attend work, they need a reasonable excuse and they need to be able to substantiate that. In these circumstances, it's probably warranting of getting an understanding of why the employee is not wanting to attend work. So are they a vulnerable employee? Have they got someone in their care that's a vulnerable employee? And perhaps there needs to be a further conversation and some measures in place for them. But certainly performance management, disciplinary processes can still be undertaken if an employee is refusing to come to work just because they want to stay at home and get JobKeeper. If they want to do that, they may be best placed to go on JobSeeker. The JobKeeper is only going to remain in place while their employment is still on foot. So processes around reminding employees of that's probably pertinent if businesses are impacted by that.
So if they want JobSeeker instead of JobKeeper, they should just walk in and quit. And they don't guarantee you $1,500 anymore, is there?
And look, these are only temporary measures in place until end of September, and none of us really know how widespread and how deep the economic impact is. So you would think that most people would be quite motivated to retain their job at this point in time.
Yeah, I posted a comment about it on social media on the weekend, and I was amazed by how many people commented. And I think it was a lot of accountants and business owners who were frustrated by it, like me. But it must be happening a fair bit, because the more I talk about it out there, the more I'm hearing. You've had heaps of inquiries about that as well, haven't you, Anna?
Yep.
Yeah. So what about, with the last little while, we've been through people being in stand down because we haven't been able to open the doors. We've had people with reduced days or hours, people with reduced wages and different things. If business is starting to come back and we're starting to think about that other side, legally, what do we have to do when we sort of bring people off stand down or we bring them back into normal hours again?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it's one that goes in part with what Joe was talking about at the start, about getting an understanding of what stage your business is in and how you're going to be transitioning back to the new normal. You'll have to unpick some of those arrangements that you've put in place. So if you've stood employees down under the Fair Work Act, you've stood them down because there's been a stoppage of work. So the first question there is there now no longer a stoppage of work? And in which case work should resume as per whatever the new normal is going to be. And there'd be communication with the employees around that, and ideally lifting that stand down in writing and having communication with the employee. If you've stood down under these temporary provisions that you can utilise in line with JobKeeper, that's more around where there's no useful employment for the employee. So you might have done a full stand down, or you might have done a partial stand down. So I've had lots of clients who've reduced full-time employees down to part-time because they just, opening hours are restricted or their operational requirements have been reduced, so they don't need the employees very many hours. So you'd need to be looking at that. Keep in mind, if you've used JobKeeper temporary Fair Work Act provisions, there is notification and consultation in there. So you'll need to go through that process to go back and lift those, but it might not be an automatic case for each business, and it won't be a one size fits all. So you really need to be looking in the short to medium term to get an understanding of, is there still a stoppage of work? Is there work I can usefully re-engage the employees in? What's that going to look like with the health and safety measures? And then adjusting your stand downs or return to works based on that. But it should all be done in writing, whether that's an email or written communication, and getting a full understanding of what you've done in the first instance so you can unpick it.
Is there like a notice period or something? Like, say I've stood down as some employees and I want to open up again next Monday. It's Friday, and so I've only got the weekend in between. Would I be reasonable to say, okay, you're coming to work on Monday?
Yeah, there's a couple of moving parts to that. So the stand down under the Fair Work Act that we're normally used to is just a stoppage of work. So if your business can reopen on Monday, the employees would be expected to return to work. There are rostering requirements and timeframes though within various modern awards, so you might need to navigate those. If you're dealing with the stand downs, full or partial, under the temporary provisions under the Fair Work Act for JobKeeper, there is notification and 3 days for those things to take place. So you'd need to be transitioning out of those and accommodating that time frame. But you just want to keep your employees up to date, be transparent with them about where your business is at, and hopefully they're on board and work with you to work out what those new arrangements are going to be without, legal letters or anything like that. But certainly lifting stand down should be done in writing at least.
What if someone does come back and say, I don't want to come back because I'm worried I'm going to get it and take it home to my mother, or I don't want to catch public transport? They've got those sort of considerations. Legally, what position, I suppose, do they have or the employers have?
Yeah, so that's probably part an answer for me and part an answer for Joe, but they need to have a legitimate basis to not attend work. So an employee always needs to be ready, willing and able to work if we go back to the core employment law concepts. So you'd really need to be having a conversation with them to understand what is the risk. Is it to them or is it to someone else in their home? And are the measures that Joe talked about before in terms of the hygiene practices, even when you're coming home from work, that you're taking off any potential infected items and you're having a shower and doing all of those things, and you can reduce those risks. If you can get to a point where that's reasonable for the employee and for the business, then the expectation would be that the employee returns to work. If they ultimately decide, look, it's too risky, I'm not sure about the second wave, I don't want to risk it, you might look at, is there arrangements where they could continue to work from home? Could they take a period of unpaid leave or perhaps a period of paid leave? Or is it the case that the business and the employee do need to part ways? So lots of variable options there, I think.
You got any comments to add to that, Joe?
Just to enhance what Justine's saying there, and I think it's absolutely critical that as part of a return to work, return to business plan, that there is information for workers on how to reduce the risks of bringing COVID into their home environment. Because particularly if firstly, we don't want workers coming back, not only if they've got COVID, but also if they potentially are vulnerable. So if they've got underlying health conditions that you might say, actually, you're more at risk, we really don't want you coming back. But there may also be individuals at home who could be at risk. So whether it's a dependent or an elderly person or somebody with low immunity. So for the worker to know that they should themselves put a plan in place, limit the belongings that they take from the house, observe good COVID controls while they're out, and when they get home, make sure they wipe their things down with some form of suitable cleaner, and then be able to have a shower and wash their clothes through. So they're actually that line of defense when they walk into their home. I mean, certainly from my perspective, I've been out and about for the last few weeks. The first day that I went out, I was exhausted from having to actually think about all the things I needed to think about. And this is my day job. So it's certainly taken me a little while to get into the swing of it. But now that I've done it, I've actually got myself into a good sort of routine and practice on what limited things that I take out and then bring back in. So an individual having a plan, not just a business plan, is really important.
I always remember a business leader once telling me about the importance of a third space anyway. So maybe this will actually help with the mental wellness of people by having that third space of the shower. I remember he saying he went to the shower, he washed all the work off him. Now we're actually washing off the germs as well before he goes down and says good day to the kids.
A good example just around some concerns around public transport too that we're going to introduce is staggered start times. Just something very simple like that where the team can start quite early so they're missing that kind of peak of people travelling in. It's just one simple thing that some business owners can look at doing as well.
And there's lots more ways to get to work rather than just getting public transport, in that we've got people that are planning to sort of share ride share on the way in, or pick each other up and do some different hours so they miss traffic. And are there any other sort of practical things you want to raise to make sure we've shared those, Anna, from a coming back to work sort of perspective, and maybe even getting into some of that flexi-working, remote working considerations as well?
Yeah, well, we're still working through all of the flexible working arrangements. At the moment, bar 3 people, our team are at home. And it's something that Justine could talk to as well, but flexible working arrangements can be quite varied. And I think it's really important that you know what the individual circumstances are, because if you start to dictate on one person a standard way of doing things, it might not fit in with things like picking up kids from school or, you know, all that kind of stuff. So it's really important that, again, like I was saying before, we've got to lay over the top of all of these regulations, the individual's requirements, and see what we can come up with together from a consultative perspective.
Well, we've talked a lot about health safety here, haven't we? But there's probably also a discussion around psychological sort of safety, in that not everybody reacts to these situations the same way, and there might be some that are more prone to anxiety about such things as well. And I mean, that's one thing I know, and by you going to the team and actually doing that survey and giving them input into what conclusions you make, sort of helps with that.
I mean, some of the employees that people have will be living in 1-bedroom apartments, and so they'll be working off their kitchen table, and they've got no third space, you know, they've got nowhere to go, and so that can have a real effect on their mental health. So it's knowing who that's happening for as well.
Oh, look, I see so much burnout, not just in the business owner community, but in just the employee community at the moment. I mean, you imagine you walk out for breakfast and your computers are there on a weekend as well, because you have to work from there.
John, just going back to that flexible working, it'd be good for Justine to chime in here a little bit too, around the business's requirements on flexible working and some of the rules around that.
I was just being polite and waiting for John to...
Just never shut up, Justine. That's my problem.
But yeah, look, the key thing that businesses need to be really mindful of is the span of hours for work. So if they're operating under a modern award, the last thing they want to do is introduce something and then inadvertently increase their costs because they've got to cover overtime employees outside of those spans of hours. There is some flexibility in some awards at the moment around that. Clark's Award has some flexibility provisions, but really to factor in employees working from home, particularly when the schools have been closed, so that there's acceptance that they might work later at night, and no overtime payable for those types of hours. So you really want to have a good look at your modern award and understand what your span of hours is under that and what the rules for overtime are. You might need to actually enter into what's called an individual flexibility agreement, or an IFA, which sits with the award but gives you flexibility around that. So you really want to be keeping at the back of your mind what's going to work for the business and the individual, and then how do we make that fit from an employment law perspective, because you really don't want underpayments or claims at the back end of all of this. When you've tried to do the right thing, nothing's in writing. Employees got records saying, well, I work till midnight and I should get overtime, and the business has the onus of disproving that essentially, and then they don't have records. So time and wage records, and really check those industrial instruments.
It's a real risk, isn't it, to the employers in that regard? Just
one other question on that, Justine, if you don't mind. When an employee requests flexible working, an employer has an obligation to obviously review that, and they can reasonably refuse a request. Can you give some tips around things that employers need to be really conscious of when they're looking at those arrangements?
Yeah, so there is the right to request flexible work arrangements under the Fair Work Act, and there is the right of refusal, but it needs to be on reasonable business grounds. So at the moment, we're in a very different world, because the majority of people have actually probably proven that you can do your job from home, whereas the perception probably before COVID-19 was, no, we can't. It's extra cost for equipment. We're not going to get productivity. We physically need you in the office, and a lot of those things have now been dispelled. But you will need to, again, it's a process that needs to be done in writing. There are certain reasons why an employee can make that request. So if they're a carer, they're a young mum, all of those have got an illness or disability. So you need to assess that and look at what are your business requirements going forward. So if it's a chef in a restaurant, there's, aside from maybe working out some arrangements around shifts, they physically need to be at that kitchen that's got the commercial license to do the job. And so what might work for that individual is not going to work for an office manager that might be able to do some of their stuff from home. So there is certainly scope to say no, but you need to be able to back that up, and it's a process, as I said, that needs to be in writing. And I think the world has changed. We will now see a lot of requests that have previously been declined actually being workable for businesses now.
Yeah, well, Nicole's actually got a question on there about employees that have now been working from home and the idea now that they don't want to come back to working full time in the office. I think you've probably sort of answered it there. And, what are the rights of employees and employers in this instance? It sounds like an employer can refuse on reasonable grounds a request for flexi working or remote working.
Yeah, so there's two different concepts. We're talking about requests for flexible work arrangements that are provided for under the Fair Work Act, and then we have like individual flexibility agreements that businesses can reach with an employee if, for example, they want to finish early on a Friday to pick up their children from school, and so they might work some extra hours on other days and therefore not get paid overtime because it's to their benefit. So there's two distinct types of arrangements and legal protections. Again, it's got to work for the business, so the business still needs to be able to get an economic value out of that employee with those flexible arrangements that are going to be in place.
Okay, guys, one more quick question for you all around testing for COVID. Can an employer ask or insist on an employee to be tested?
Justine, do you want to answer that legally, and then I'll answer it practically in terms of health and safety?
Yeah, I think there's two parts to this. Again, it's going to depend on the circumstances that you're dealing with in terms of that. And I think the testing requirements, and Joe might be able to give us more of an update on that, are different in every state. But if you've got an employee that has been diagnosed with COVID-19 or has been in contact with someone that has had or has COVID-19, there are very different rules around them and self-isolation. The biggest issue I'm finding is that businesses are saying, well, when are they going to be fit to come back? When are they safe to come back? And can we ask them to be tested at the back end to make sure they're clear? You'd certainly want to be asking for a medical clearance from that employee to make sure that they can return to work. Can we demand that everyone go and get tested and then everyone gets the vaccine once it's available? I think the answer to that is probably a no, and practically it's just not going to be able to be something businesses would reasonably implement. But I think where there's significant risk of a worker and the impact on their workplace, then there might be scope to at least get a medical clearance or a test to confirm that they're negative in order to facilitate a return to work.
Add anything to that, Joe?
Absolutely, Justine. Agree wholeheartedly with what you said there. Putting in place your testing arrangements in your business return to work plan will be really important. And as you've said, it is dependent upon the state or the territory and what their testing arrangements are, the access to the tests, and I guess indeed the business profile. So if you've got a business that perhaps workers are more exposed to, or if they were positive, presented risk to others, then you potentially would have a different testing arrangement than a low risk environment for the workers and others. So it's based on the scenario of the business, as well as the access to the kits, as well as the state or territory testing regimes and arrangements.
Yeah, I suppose that sort of almost flows into what I call the runny nose policy that maybe we need to have in the workplace as well. Do we need to update, I'm interested in your thoughts probably here, Anna, do we need to update sick leave policies, or can we put a runny nose policy in there to say that they shouldn't come to work or can't come to work?
Justine, I'm going to flick to you first on this one. I've got my views on this, and I think everyone's an adult, but I'm sure Justine will have some legal things to say here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the employee has an obligation to ensure their own safety. That's a legal obligation embedded in legislation. So I think the issue probably goes to whether they have enough paid sick leave to cover them. And I think a lot of employees will probably soldier on and go to work because the alternate for them is that they have to stay at home on unpaid leave. So there's probably going to be a bit of a reset in terms of those entitlements going forward, and what incentive businesses might put in place to encourage employees to stay at home if they're unwell. And we all know now that we have incredibly flexible and nimble businesses that have been reactive and enabled people to be able to work from home. The rules will still apply. The employee might still be sick and shouldn't actually be working from home. But look, I think it's going to vary for everyone. Yes, you should have a policy in place. Yes, you should have notification and evidentiary requirements. But as Anna said, we're all adults here, and you really want to be encouraging a situation where employees are cautious. If they've got any symptoms, they shouldn't be presenting for work, you know, and getting to the business and then going, oh, I feel sick, I need to go home, and potentially affecting people. So it's just an education piece, and encouraging them to utilise whatever alternate work arrangements can be in place so that they can minimise that risk.
Yeah,
in addition to that, Joe.
Yeah, I'm going to put my, this is where health and safety for me gets interesting, but for others they go, oh no, it's hierarchy of control time. But the reality is there are measures within health and safety legislation that provide for this scenario. The reality is we do not want anybody in the workplace that could or is potentially be positive. And that is in itself isolation, and that's a higher order control in the hierarchy of control for health and safety. As soon as they walk into the workplace, we're then reliant on human behaviour, and that increases risk because we know about the unreliability of human behaviour. So staying at home and isolation is critical. Your controls that you have in place in your business then become even more important if there is the potential for an individual to walk in. It's not a reason they should walk in, but if they did walk in and developed symptoms or were asymptomatic and then found to be so, the controls that you have in the workplace are your best line of defence. So that's where they really should not be allowed to let drop. So
I think we've got a new policy coming in, and we're going to call it the adult policy. We're all going to be adults.
And on
Ladies,
top of that, you know, from a trust and loyalty perspective and a communication perspective, business, all of us need to have really open conversations with all of our team members about all this stuff.
Yeah.
And yeah, the adult card gets played a lot, and it should continue to be played. So as long as we're communicating, I think we can get through all of this really easily.
Yeah. Ladies, I want to thank you very, very much. We covered a lot of ground there in the last 45 minutes. Well, we've gone over 58 minutes. But thank you very much for your insights. I mean, obviously, there's a lot going on in the business world from the employer and the employee perspective. That, you know, coming back to work, you know, some people will be more anxious about it than others. Some are more worried about different things than others, and some are more vulnerable than others as well. So what we've covered here today, I think, is really valuable for anyone out there to be thinking about. So thank you very much, Joe. Thank you, Justine, and thank you, Anna. I want to give a quick plug to everyone out there for our next Calm COVID Convo. It's going to be on Tuesday. And we're lucky enough to have Kate Carnell, who is the Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman. She used to be the Minister for the ACT, but she now is the one out there flying the flag to government for small business and family enterprise. So we're going to have a talk to her about the future of small business and all those different things that she thinks small businesses is going to need in the next little while. So I'm really excited for that interview on Tuesday. But keep an eye out for other convos that will be coming up. We're going to bring all this to a head also with a day that we're calling Rebound. And the idea of Rebound is to start to truly shift that conversation to the other side of the COVID curve, remaining completely sensitive and understanding of those businesses that are still, you know, not having the best of times and not necessarily able to get back to work yet. But on Rebound Day, we're going to have a whole day of webinars, online sessions available. Some will be workshops, some will be presentations, some will be panel discussions like these. You can choose to come to all of them, or you can choose to come to one. So keep an eye out for that. That will be released shortly once we've confirmed our speakers and everything. But once again, thank you, ladies, and all the best to everyone out there. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Ben.